And then can you please help me welcome Dr. Len Peterson.
Thank you, Drew. I was going to call this talk the Magical Mystery Tour, and then I ran into Drew, and he's from Liverpool, which is, so we're talking about John and Paul and the cavern. So there's kind of spirits occurring here. I'd like to thank the Scottsdale Museum for having me come down. I really appreciate it. The origins of my talk today and book actually started here 2 years ago. I was the chairman of the Russell Museum Board of Directors, so I brought the directors down and the entire staff of the museum, and we got to see Tim Peterson's Curtis collection, which really kind of blew me away, and it's probably the most amazing collection I've ever seen. So that's 2 years later, I'm back here with the book, and I had no idea I was going to do that. I'd like to thank Bob Ring for helping me out the last couple days, and Wade Weber. We spent about 6 months trying to get this together. I sent him a toupee because I think I tore all his hair out trying to get this straightened out. But today we're going to celebrate Edward Curtis, who I think is the most consequential artist of the American West, the indigenous people who loved him, and also celebrate Tim Peterson's collection and also this great museum that True West, my favorite magazine, has picked as the top museum in the country. So let's start the bus tour, and I think it's a tour that hopefully will be very memorable for you. We're going to cover almost 2 centuries of American history, from the time when the world and the West was only lit by fire, there was no electricity, to the time after the atomic bomb was dropped, and think of all the things in between. It's pretty an amazing time in American and world history. So in 1907, the New York Herald dubbed the North American Indian, those are the volumes on the left, the greatest book project since the King James Version of the Bible, which was 1611. Curtis had a profound effect on how Americans viewed Native Americans and gave a respect to the Native Americans that they'd never had before. It took him almost 30 years. The first book over there, we had the books, and each book, 1 through 20, had a big, large portfolio volume that went with it. Started in 1907, the first publication. Last one was 1930. He took over 40,000 slides, visited with 80 tribes, 2.5 million words, ethnologic words in the text. And all of this was funded initially by J.P. Morgan, that in 1906 gave him almost $2 million, which Curtis blew through in about 4 years. One of the things I want to point out before I get is, one of the special things about Curtis is that he documented 80 tribes. Most of the Western artists either focused on the Southwest or Montana, the North, mainly because of the railroads. They promoted the Southwest and Montana, and so the artists kind of located there. Some may say these areas have the greatest, most picturesque Native Americans, and maybe that's the reason too. But Curtis included everyone. Now there's an Indian legend that warns that you die twice. Once when you take your final breath, and then again the last time someone says your name. Your spirit lives on as long as people keep remembering you. Thus the need to print the legends. It prevents a human or race from vanishing. So, pictorialism. Curtis was caught up in the Romantic movement in American art that started in the 1770s, started kind of diminishing in right at the time of the Civil War. The romance was over with the Civil War, kind of like the Vietnam War affected everyone in this room. But pictorialism was taking a photograph and making it look like a painting. It was art for art's sake. A lot of art tells a story, and that affects your brain, and you're thinking, what's going on there and that. But Curtis's art affects the soul. And it's more of why are we here as Americans? Who are we? What happened to Native Americans? I think it makes us think a little deeper than normal paintings. But at heart, Curtis was a pictorialist. He wasn't documenting how the Native Americans looked at his time. He went back in the past, as all Romantic artists do, such as Lafayette Painter Dixon, Charlie Russell, and many others, the nostalgics. This is horse capture, and this is a sepia tone photogravure of Curtis's. Horse capture grew up west of where I grew up in Montana. And if God had a color he was going to use to paint with, it would be sepia. And the book we produced here has probably, I think, the best reproductions of his photogravures of any book. The fellow that worked in Ansel Adams' studio photographed all these photogravures for me. And then every part of the way, the graphic designer, we went through every image and photo checked it, printer, to give the best reproduction possible. Paper is silk paper, no wood product, from Garda, Italy. So pictorialism was all about the feeling, the mood, the spirit, and so it used soft focus. You can see on the left, everything's a little bit out of focus. On the right, it's in sharp focus. A lot of pictorialists would put grease on their lens to blur the image. They would kick the camera when they were going to take the picture to give this kind of nuanced look. Now, a lot of folks say, well, why didn't he just photograph the way Native Americans were during his lifetime? Well, this is how Native Americans look like on the right. I love this picture. These are two of my favorite people. That's Two Guns White Calf on the right. He at the time was the most famous Indian in the country. He was a Blackfeet from Glacier Park country. And after Geronimo died in 1909, Two Guns White Calf was the most famous Indian in America until he died in 1933. A lot of people think he was on the Buffalo Nickel that was designed by James Earl Fraser. But he also, in 1972, was used by the Washington Redskins for their logo, which they have now changed. And on the left is his good friend, Louis Hill, the son of James J. Hill of the Empire Builder, Great Northern, all you that love Glacier Park. That man there built everything in Glacier Park. So if you love Glacier Park, Louis Hill needs your salute. Now, one of the other interesting things is, today we're all very casual, but even probably when we were children, or at least in the 100 years ago, everything was formal. This is on top of a mountain in Glacier, and look how formal Louis Hill is. He's got a white shirt on and tie. This is how people dressed. You mountain climbed, you dressed in this. You went to parades, horseback riding. It was very formal. And Curtis felt that Native Americans deserved that formal look too. So when he photographed them, he just said, bring your Sunday best. And this idea that he had a big wagon load of props and put props on these Native Americans, 99% of the time is totally untrue. And, but Curtis loved to dress up just like Louis Hill. Here's Curtis high in the mountains, probably Rockies, could be the Badlands of South Dakota, and I love this. This is what he wanted America to see him as. And look at, he's in his suit just like Louis Hill. And for me, there's another level of symbolism to this. The loose rocks, when they stop moving, is called the angle of repose. If any of you are Wallace Stegner fans, it's an engineering term, but it's a symbol for people at the point of kind of the pinnacle of their success, where the rocks stop moving, they stop moving and find themselves. And around 1907, 1908, that period was Curtis's angle of repose. This saying I just love. I keep life principles, and it's one of them. And I think we could all tell our children and grandchildren this, that many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. I mean, I could probably end there. Maybe if you remember one thing from this talk, that's it. But this is Curtis. This is an interesting photograph. He looks pretty good for 79. But the problem is he was 59. And this was at the end, this was his final book he did in Alaska. And, you know, kind of like Maynard Dixon, Mark, he's got a cigarette in his hand, Charlie Russell, they all have their pictures taken with it. But he looks terrible for someone that's 59. And we'll talk a little bit more about his health problems that really haven't been discussed before. This was photographed in Nome, Alaska. The Lohman brothers had a photographic studio there. Amundsen and Perry, the explorers, had their picture taken there. Their studio burned down in a fire in the early 30s, and they made their money from their reindeer production. And they teamed up with Macy's with the reindeer, and that's why at Christmas Santa Claus has a reindeer. You're going to see all sorts of things that you never thought you were going to hear of today. So. And then you take the advertising agency in Chicago, Sunbloom, that Howard Turpinning started with, and you have the Coca-Cola Santa Claus. So now we have American Christmas. So J.P. Morgan was the cow from which others drew their milk. He and Roosevelt were probably the two most powerful men in the world. It's often said he was the richest man in the world. He wasn't even close at that time. John D. Rockefeller was, by a long shot. But he was still worth a measly billion back then in today's terms. And J.P. Morgan has been really misrepresented in a lot of articles as if he and Theodore Roosevelt hated each other because of Roosevelt was the trust buster. In 1901, he breaks up the Northern Trust. Roosevelt broke up one trust that J.P. Morgan was involved in, and through his entire presidency, he'd never touched Morgan again. Morgan saved the country in the Panic of 1893. In the old days, recessions and depressions were called panics. 1907, he saves the country. He saves Roosevelt in a coal strike. Roosevelt gave him millions of dollars to be elected. J.P. Morgan was one of the great book collectors in the world and wanted the North American Indian to be the greatest book collection ever produced in America, which it, I think, truly is. But in 1906, Curtis enters his office in New York City, and Morgan gives him about $75,000 to be used over 5 years, and they thought the whole project would be done in 5 years. Well, in 5 years, there were a few books done, and that was it, and Curtis blew through a couple million. But he also made Curtis do everything: sales, produce the books. They're very expensive to produce. One set, if you signed up, was $75,000 in today's money. So mainly reserved for wealthy libraries and very wealthy people. This is the one that supposedly legend has it that melted J.P. Morgan's heart, and that's he gave Curtis the money after he saw this image. Now, the idea of the vanishing race, this is the first image in the first portfolio, and one of his most iconic images. The idea of the vanishing race was nothing new that Curtis made up. The vanishing race had been around for 100 years. James Fenimore Cooper, Leatherstocking Tales, had book after book about the last Indians to survive. There was a large group of folks in the 1900s that believed by 1900 there wouldn't be any natives left. They'd all be dead. And they came close. Smallpox killed 90% of all Native Americans by 1900. There were only 235,000 folks left. The other idea of the vanishing American was that they weren't going to vanish, but their culture was going to vanish, which it did, thanks to ethnic cleansing by the Anglos. So our story on Curtis begins like a lot of people's story, actually 8 years before he was born. Curtis was born in 1868, but this is 1860. And this young man goes into the photographic studio of Matthew Brady, probably the greatest photographer in American history. Matthew Brady photographed 11 presidents, first ladies, everybody famous, all the generals from Custer, Sheridan, you name it. They were all photographed by Brady. He was iconic and a god to Curtis. But the power of photography was first seen in this image. Lincoln came in as was routinely known as a country bumpkin. His hair was disheveled when he came into Matthew Brady's studio on February 27th, 1860. He kind of walked with a shuffle. And Brady brought in the Doric column on the left, put his hand on books. They got him a nice coat, cleaned up his hair, used clothespins to bring his coat in to look like it was tailored. And afterwards, Lincoln probably should have been rehearsing for his speech that night. It was the famous Cooper's Union speech, which is considered one of the greatest political and constitutional speeches in American history. Afterwards, Lincoln said that this photo and the Cooper Union speech made him president. So that's the power of photography that lasted for generations and motivated Curtis in many ways. You know, all young kids in that era wanted to be photographers, and that's one of the reasons. This is a photo that you all have had, that you've all collected. This is on the $5 bill. And this is about 6 months after the last photo, he grows a beard, because some girl told him he looked better with a beard. And so, such a famous image. It also ended up on a 3-cent stamp in 1923. So this is Matthew Brady. His life is much like Curtis. They grew up poor. He had eye problems. He had an eye infection, and became wildly famous. Had a great eye for assistance, just like Curtis. But like a lot of studio owners, he took credit for other photographers in his studio. So Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner, famous photographers, took the photos at the Civil War, but he took credit for them. He also was a terrible person with money. He went bankrupt, just like Curtis, in poverty when he died. So their lives really mirrored each other. Curtis got in trouble with his brother Aishel. Aishel went up to Alaska and took a bunch of photos of Alaska, brought him back, and then Curtis wrote an article in Scribner's and said that he had been up there, Edward had been up there, not Aishel. And gave Aishel no credit. The two brothers split and they never talked again the rest of their lives. And Aishel stayed in Seattle and became a very famous local photographer. So this is the photo from Antietam in September 1862 at Sharpsburg, Maryland, that changed everything in the American psyche. For the Romantics, war had been something grand and romantic, and this was starkly showed that it wasn't a romantic deal to go to war. Now this is kind of an interesting one. Generally, they couldn't take photos during the battle because the film was too slow, the camera shutter speed was too slow, so they'd come in after the battle was over. The Confederates were not buried, the Union soldiers were generally buried. So all the ones you see in Ken Burns in the Civil War, they're usually Confederates dead like this. And a lot of people go, well, this is the real thing. I really like real photography. Well, they did the same thing in the field. They moved bodies around for effect. You know, 3 is good when you plant 3 trees in your yard, you know, or whatever. So they'd put 3, they would move bodies, they'd have some of the people lay down and act like they're dead for effect. But when people lined up in New York City to go up to Brady's studio on the second floor and look at the stereographs. They had the stereo viewers. They were just shocked. And the power of that lasted, well, it's still lasting today. The most famous Ken Burns specialist in the Civil War, thanks to Matthew Brady. Now, photography was used out west to document famous happenings. This is the Union Pacific in May 1869, coming together at Promontory Summit. I think of interest here is how formal, again, everybody is. They're in suits, they're out in the boonies. 13,000 Chinese were used from the Bay Area, Sacramento, east. Of course, they're not represented. But it also emphasizes the importance of transcontinental railroads. Karl Marx called it the annihilation of space by time, which is a great line. Trips that took weeks or months from New York to the West Coast now took days, and afforded Curtis the ability to go all over the West on a train. He was on trains a lot through his career. And the first one was in 1869. 1883, we've got the Southern Pacific Railway finished from New Orleans through your country here to Los Angeles up to San Francisco on the West Coast. The Northern Pacific was finished in 1883 from Minneapolis through southern Montana, Yellowstone Park, and on to Seattle. 1885 was the Santa Fe, who employed a lot of Taos artists, especially Taos. And then in 1893, the last transcontinental railway was the Great Northern. It went from Minnesota right close to Plentywood, where we grew up, and in northeastern Montana through Glacier Park and on to Seattle. This was typical photography. Now, if you think Curtis was out there in the West and he was the first photographer, that is another total misconception. For 30 years, photographers had been out photographing Native Americans. These are by L.A. Huffman, quite documentary. They're not art for art's sake. But this is how most of them photographed. I did 4 versions of this book about 20 years ago. I did a book on L.A. Huffman, photographer of the American West, and it was amazingly well received. Everything changed in 1888 when George Eastman comes out with his Kodak camera. It was film camera, and you bought it sent out from Rochester, New York, loaded with 100 images, and you took your 100 images, and it cost $25, which is like $750, so a lot of people couldn't afford it. Then you sent it back to Rochester, they developed it, and for $10, and then loaded the camera back up and sent it to you. All the images then were circular. So if you see old images that are circular, they're from these original Kodak cameras, number 1 and 2. By 1900, they had the Brownie camera. Millions sold in 1900. So when Curtis was going out to all these to see the snake dance or the potlatch or the Sundance, there were tons of tourists that have kind of was a real strain on the ceremonies, along with professional photographers. So Curtis is born in 1868 in Wisconsin, real close to Georgia O'Keeffe and Roland Reed, the other great pictorialist. At 5, they moved to south of Minneapolis in LeSueur County. And remember the old Jolly Green Giant, ho, ho, ho thing? You know, this is LeSueur. It was a very fertile valley. Curtis's father, Aishel Johnson, he went by Johnson, had been a Civil War chaplain. And he was sick, I think, with tuberculosis when he got out of the Civil War. Like a lot of people, Vanderbilt, Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius, his son, died in the Civil War of tuberculosis. Lots of people died of tuberculosis. In fact, 1 in 7 people, this is a whole nother world that we don't see today in America. 1 in 7 people in the 1800s died of tuberculosis in the United States. Every one of you in past generations have family members with tuberculosis. You think Hitler and Mao and Stalin were bad, but they kill 100 million people in the 20th century. Smallpox killed 300 million. Tuberculosis still 300 million. Today, 2 million people still die of tuberculosis. And I think Curtis's father had tuberculosis. And a lot of people kind of dismiss this bringing up, and I think it's the most important part of his life because his father was a circuit rider for God, United Church, Brethren Church, and he went all over giving talks at these little towns, and it was perfect for Curtis. They went to towns where they spoke in tongues, German, French, and different languages. Curtis watched the rituals and the ceremonies in church. He heard about melodramatic events like Noah being swallowed by the whale, the parting of the Red Sea, and Lazarus coming back from the dead from Jesus. So it was a perfect setup for him to relate to the bottom of the barrel in the United States, the Native Americans. And he also learned from his father, and I think people that have charisma can learn a little of it, but they obviously are born with it. But he's a very charismatic person, obviously, to get Native Americans to let him photograph them. 10,000 Native Americans participated in this project. It's the biggest family album ever in American history. And today they all love it. The people that got photographed, they have the descendant projects at the Curtis Foundation. Their great scholar, Timothy Gravens, was very helpful on this project. But his father is sick, and so in 1887, 88, the old big dry up, the winter waiting for a Chinook that Russell's famous for, bad winter on the northern plains, Curtis and his father get on the Northern Pacific and come out to Port Orchard, which is across the Puget Sound. His father died 6 months later at 47, and I think he had tuberculosis. The interesting thing, and if any of you have Curtis books and are really up on it, you know, there's a source, certain sources say Curtis fell and hurt his back and was in bed for a year, which I totally don't believe. I don't know of any back injury so severe that you'd be bed for a year and then be climbing mountains the next year. I think the standard scenario was that you take care of someone with tuberculosis in a small cabin. I think he picked up tuberculosis from his father, and his wife Clara's cousin William Phillips said he looked white and blanched, which was a description of tuberculosis. It was called the White Plague. At that point, they didn't know it was communicable. They thought it was inherited. It was not until Koch, a German scientist, figured out the germ theory. I could talk about tuberculosis for hours, but we'll go on. But this is a picture of his father, Johnson Curtis, that was so important to him, and there are very few photographs of him. All these images I'm showing you are in the book. So father dies, it's around the late 1880s. Look how thin he is there. He's having a picnic with his future wife, Clara, and their friend. Back then, a young lady and man never had a picnic alone. They always had a chaperone. So if you see old photographs of people on picnics, usually it's not two people. She initially loved his idea of being a professional photographer, but she thought he would be a professional photographer in Seattle, and he became wildly famous photographing rich people and their children, which he soon got bored with and really didn't care for. This is a John Ferry painting. It's on the back of my John Ferry book, and I just love this. This is Seattle about 1890, and this shows the Native American canoes along with the clipper ship, and this is kind of what the Seattle waterfront looked like. This is what studios looked like for a long time. This is one of Curtis's studio pictures. I can't go into photographic developing stories, but I'll just tell you this, until the 1890s, when you took a photograph with your wet plate, which came in the 1840s, dry plates 1870s, when you took the plate, you had to put your developing or your paper on it, and it was called printing out paper, and you developed it in the sun, not in liquids. You know, we all grew up with that magic. That was done on developing out paper. That didn't start until the 1890s. About the time Curtis started his first pictures, they started using developing out paper. the whole story of photography is in the book, and at hopefully a level you can all understand. So, Princess Angeline, this was his first famous picture, either late 1895, 1896. The interesting thing here is Brady dies in 1896, and then this is Curtis's first great photo. It's almost as if Brady died and handed the baton of photographic genius to Curtis that year. The other thing I find interesting, in 1927, Curtis's last trip to Alaska, and that's where Ansel Adams goes into Yosemite up on the diving board and takes his first famous photograph, and now Curtis almost hands off the baton to Ansel Adams, along with Dorothea Lange in the 30s. So this is the clam digger, often represented as Princess Angeline. She was dead. This was from 1898, so she'd been dead for 2 years. And I can tell you one thing, that's not the back of a 90-year-old bending over doing clams. But these are very famous, award-winning photographs, some of his most famous early photogravures. And then this is Homeward, and one of my most favorite pictorialist images. It's just beautiful when you can see it in the book or the real thing. So, Mount Rainier, Albert Bierstadt, 1892, romantic painting demonstrating the beauty of the landscape and also the little people in the canoes, what's called the sublime in romantic art, humans being overwhelmed by the greatness of the landscape. That's what was called the sublime. I put this in here, and I'm not going to belabor all the legends that need to be updated. But the famous one about Curtis in 1898 going up and saving George Burt Grinnell and the other famous scientists didn't happen. Sorry. John Tulliver, who wrote one of the forewords for me, the great American biographer, did the biography on Grinnell. And he told me a few years ago when he was doing research, he said Grinnell wasn't anywhere close to Mount Rainier. Grinnell kept a diary, and he wrote thousands of letters that are in Yale University, and so you can find out where he was, and he wasn't anywhere near Rainier, so I'm sorry. Tim Grayhavens, the great photographer, Curtis expert from Seattle, wrote an article recently on Pacific Quarterly just about that same subject, that it didn't happen. So, but genius loves company. And this is George Burt Grinnell, one of the most famous men in America. Everybody adored him. This is when he was at Yale. He became the head editor of Forest and Stream, started the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887 with Theodore Roosevelt, which is now headquartered in Missoula, inspired the Audubon Society, and is considered the father of Glacier Park, and also wrote tons of books on Native Americans, and spent every summer like a bird would come in the summer and then leave in winter. That's how he got his middle name, Bird. We do know for sure, I think the first time Curtis really spent a lot of time with the great scientists, Grinnell included, was on a trip put together by E.H. Harriman, very famous. By then he was controlling the Union Pacific, very wealthy man, only had a 6th grade education. A lot of people said he put this big scientific expedition to Alaska together in 1899 to associate himself and make himself look better. He said he wanted to go to Alaska to shoot a Kodiak bear. Even Yellowstone Kelly was on board. So this is Noah's Ark. This is the boat they took up from Seattle. They had dinner at the Rainier Club in Seattle and got on this boat in the summer of 1899. And they had cattle and sheep and scientists, called Noah because he'd have 2 geologists and 2 ethnologists. He had room for 2 photographers. It was Curtis, and he brought along an assistant. But Curtis, on this trip, at night they would give lectures. And so Curtis got to listen to Grinnell, to sit at his feet and all of the great. There's never been a scientific expedition in world history that comes close to this. They ended up publishing like a 13-volume set on their findings. That's John Muir on the left, and John Burroughs on the right, Muir Sierra Club fame. And that's the caliber of people that were on this trip. So it was great connections for Curtis. He was now kind of one of the club. It was the days when they could go up and name glaciers. So they named Harriman Glacier. They named a bunch of glaciers after Ivy League schools. They brought back 600 species that had never been identified before. Tons of stuff. Harriman had an Edison phonograph, the old wax disc that Curtis embraced, and he would take it along when he was with the Indians and record their songs and stuff. But he got that on this trip. So this is Clara in 1905. They have Florence, Hal, Beth. Adolph Muir, Curtis's guy that developed all his, worked in the dark room, took this picture. Curtis was gone so much by then, he didn't even take a picture of his own family. He had to have his assistant. And his assistant was brilliant. Curtis knew how to pick the right people for the job. He was a financial disaster, but he was a good judge of character. And this is a picture of Adolph Muir along with Catherine, called her Billy, in 1911. Muir would die in 1913. And I don't think Curtis's photographs or photogravures were as good after Muir died. So this is Edward Curtis. This is how he projected himself to America, the Abercrombie and Fitch, dashing, man, and through up until from 1900 to World War I, he was really famous. He, probably hearkening back to his father, embraced Native American religion and ceremonies. This is the Sundance that he went out to, I think in 1898. He said in his portfolio, this is from 1898. And along with George Burt Grinnell and these sort of spiritual connections with Native Americans, it really propelled him into wanting to photograph all the tribes west of the Missouri. And another thing to note is a lot of his most famous images were created before he got the money from Morgan. And he didn't have a big entourage, so it was just him. He had a wagon full of costumes. He was in bankruptcy all the time, so he didn't have anything. So this is a great statement. A.C. Hayden was probably the most famous anthropologist in the world. He fell in love with Curtis in 1909. He said, special attention is given to the religious life and ideas of the Indians, as Mr. Curtis rightly holds that the genius of a people is best expressed in those customs, ceremonies, and ideals which are grouped under the general term of religion. And I think this is the core of Curtis's motivations and for photographing so many of the ceremonies. So this is placating the spirit of the slain eagle. Native American legend was the eagle flew up to the spirit world and brought the spirit back, so it was not good. They did not kill eagles. It's two whistles in his ceremonial costume. Offering to the mystery, offering to the great mystery, and the sun worshiper. 1903, the Washington Historical Society invites Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce in northeastern Oregon, north of where I am now, to Washington, to Seattle, to show him around and celebrate him. And Curtis gets him to his studio. That's Chief Joseph on the left. Edmund Meany was a real close friend of Curtis's. He was a professor at the University of Washington, and really Curtis's probably closest friend. He consulted a lot on academic material for the book. That's Red Thunder, Chief Joseph's cousin on the right there. This is photograph he took of Chief Joseph. He took one without a headband with his headdress on. This is one without, I think Bob Capone. His top 5 favorites, this is in the top 5 most collectible of Curtis's images. Curtis wins a pretty child photographic contest that was in Ladies' Home Journal. And a photographer named Russell, not Charlie Russell, I'm sorry, a painter, asked Curtis to come to Oyster Bay on Long Island and photograph Theodore Roosevelt's children. And then he was going to take Curtis photographs and then paint them for Theodore Roosevelt. And Curtis also took wedding pictures of one of Roosevelt's daughters. Some of you that have Curtis books, have any of you seen that picture of Curtis laying on a blanket with Roosevelt's children? Mm-hmm. Raise hands. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not Curtis, that's Russell. So I hate to be bummers. We're gonna pass out Valium at the end of this lecture. We've got Dr. Mark Sublett here, and you ready, Mark? But Theodore Roosevelt loved Curtis. He invited Curtis to the White House a number of times, introduced him to Morgan, wrote the foreword for the North American Indian, and the most famous man in the world, a wilderness warrior for 235 million acres of land and preservation. It's the days when you could go out and in 2 months could get a huge area designated a national park and didn't have to go through 2,000 reviews over 40 years to get it done. This is Geronimo, and this is from Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. William Pratt ran it, in the infamous Carlisle School. And Geronimo, Curtis took this picture of Geronimo, platinum print, when he was there. And Geronimo then went to the inauguration parade, and Curtis took several other photos of it. Now, kind of in the middle, I kind of stop in the chronologic progression, and we talk a little bit about the different photographic methods Curtis used. And this, a lot of you probably, anybody that knows anything about photography, have seen this one. The negative is the equivalent of the composite score, and the print, the performance. The great pictorialist was Alfred Stieglitz. He had a magazine called Camera Works from like 1901 until 1917, until he fell so madly in love with Georgia O'Keeffe he couldn't do anything except for take pictures of her for the next 20 years. But he was a great supporter. He and Edward Steichen, who was another famous photographer and painter, so they kind of formed this photo succession movement of pictorialism. And Curtis exhibited with them in the East Coast, West Coast. The problem is in 1907, he started moving away from the pictorialists into modern with a photograph named The Steerage. And it's considered the first modern photograph. Steichen took this picture of Stieglitz, but someone you should know in the Curtis story. And this is Georgia O'Keeffe. If you want a Trivial Pursuit question, you can ask what woman holds the highest auction record in the world of all time for a painting. Georgia O'Keeffe, 2014, 44.3 million. And so she and Stieglitz were married. Stieglitz dies in 1949 and then goes out to New Mexico to Ghost Ranch and a few other haunts. And very important people in American history. This is J.P. Morgan, the famous one. This was done in about 1902 by Steichen. If you haven't heard of Steichen, he holds the record for the second highest photograph. A couple years ago, one of his photographs of a skyscraper went for 12 million. One photograph. Man Ray holds the record at 13 million. But Steichen became the curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in the 1950s. But Steichen took this photo, and J.P. Morgan was charged like today's money $7,500 for this photograph. And look at down on the bottom right there, it looks like J.P. Morgan's got a knife in his hand, like he's stabbing, and you know, it's like human nature. They love him when he's saving the country. The next year they hate him because he's rich. You know. So platinum prints, 98% of the photographs that Curtis made were photogravures. Only 2% were other forms. Platinum print, for you that are photography fans, is like the highest form of photography. The platinum is laid right on Whatman watercolor paper. It's not put into an albumin solution like they were early on, or a gelatin solution later. And gives a quality of just stunning depth. This is one of the most collectible pieces, Curtis pieces. This is the North American Indian. You can see the 20 books corresponding 20 large volume. There were supposed to be 500. Soon they cut it down to 300 because it wasn't selling very well. They also, as they sold them, it wasn't numbered like, I'll give you number 1, 2, 3. I'll give you number 1, I'll give you number 400, because he didn't want people to know that they weren't selling. So in 1908, you get number 300 and go, hey, you better get that volume because they're selling like hotcakes. And when he died, he still hadn't sold them all. He didn't, after the World War I, he didn't sell many books and took a lot of money. The other thing while I'm talking about that is everybody talks about J.P. Morgan, but they don't talk about his son Jack, and Jack actually gave more money to Curtis for the project after J.P. dies in 1930 than J.P. did. They gave around, I think, $20 million for this project. I think the whole project somewhere between 30 and 40 million to do this. There's so many stats to talk about this, but I think that's enough. So this is one of the volumes signed by Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't sign that many. So I think the most desirable sets are the ones that are signed by him. And as far as I know, in the last 30 or 40 years, there's never been a complete set of books and portfolios that were signed by Roosevelt. Tim Grayhavens, who's putting the Curtis census together, trying to hunt down all of the volumes, has found, I think, 26 that have been signed by Theodore Roosevelt, and almost all over in institutions. Now, the photogravure process is talked about a lot in the book, but I can't go into great detail. But Curtis's photograph was put on a copper plate, and then they were hand stamped with ink. And it doesn't come up on this image, but in the book, it's got a kind of a pink tone. It's almost like a sepia tone in pink, the tonalism. And all great photographers, Ansel Adams made a big deal of this. Every image needs to go from black, there's got to be some black in the image, and white, and then every tone in between. And that makes it's called tonalization, made famous by Ansel Adams, and well accomplished by Curtis. This is through the canyon. These are all just copper plates, and when if you saw the exhibit a couple years ago, Tim had an incredible number of them. This Canyon del Muerto, and of course the famous iconic Canyon de Chelly. This is the copper plate now. Look, all the writing's reversed. They ink it and then they stamp it to get this photogravure. And it was also one of Curtis's most famous photos were the gold tones, Kurt tones. Those were developed in Japan. He had several Japanese people working in his studio in Seattle, and they made these gold tones famous. And he had to have craftsmen make special frames for him because they were a piece of glass. The image was on the back side of the glass. It wasn't glass over an image, it was on the glass. So they're very fragile. It gives a depth that's just stunning. But really the gold tones, again, is a form of tonalization. Instead of the pink from the plates or the sepia from the photogravure, they have gold tones everywhere from light to dark. He did these in the field. He'd have to take his camera and do these what are called cyanotypes. They originally kind of like blueprints. And he developed the glass plates back in the studio, but if you wanted to check real quick, like a Kodak print, he could develop these, again, out in the sun, laying in the sun, and the sun developed these. You know, until 1890 again, all of them were printing out paper. Oliver Wendell Holmes called it sun drawing. The original photographs were called sun drawings, or sun sculptures. So this is the artist in his heyday, the angle of repose. Curtis, right around 1907, 1908, he's at ground zero for the greatest event in Western history, the Custer Battle. At his time it's called the Custer Battlefield in southeast Montana. Now it's called the Battle of Little Bighorn. But there have been more books written on the Custer Battle than any other battle other than Gettysburg. There's like 12 to 1,300 books written on this battle from a lot of different perspectives. And this is his team. There's Alexander Upshaw on the left. That's his Crow interpreter. That helped him on a number of books out in Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota. Next to him is William Myers. And he has been given no credit, but Mick Gidley, one of Curtis's great scholars from Britain, said early on that he was writing most of the text. So all of you, if you're thinking, how in the world can you do all those photographs, go out around the country and then write all these incredible texts with a basic 6th grade education. William Myers he could understand Indian tongues, did dictation. He was brilliant and really given no credit until he left Curtis right before he went to Oklahoma, the Killers of the Flower Moon era. There's Edmund Meany again, and then there's Jack Red Cloud on the right, and then the famous Chief Red Cloud in the center. But they're out at the Custer Battlefield. And Curtis did a lot of the Custer Battlefield. There used to be a train that went from there to northern Nebraska, and then they could go up to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they would go back and forth to photograph the Sioux. And it was called the Custer Daily General train. Anybody know what this is? There you go. This is what it looked like when Curtis did. Guts and Borglum didn't start this until 1921. It used to be called Black Elk Speak, after the famed Chief Black Elk. And it got named Rushmore for a lawyer from New York City. That's just northwest of the Pine Ridge Reservation. This is Alexander Upshaw, the Crow interpreter that I showed you in his Anglo clothes. This is a beautiful photo revered. It's really one of the most bittersweet images that Curtis ever did, because he went to Carlisle and he actually bought the assimilation thing. Not every Native American that went to Carlisle was just treated terribly, and it's just, some of them embraced it, and he was one of them. In fact, after he was at Carlisle, he wrote in their magazines, touted it, you guys, all you Native Americans need to assimilate and enter the white man's world. Give up your ceremonies. And he went out to Genoa, Nebraska, and was a teacher there. Carlisle was the only off-reservation school east of the Mississippi. After that, all of them were in the West. And he married a divorced white woman with 3 children. And I'm often amazed at, when I go through these different folks out at this time period, how many of Native Americans married divorced white women. Kind of divorced white women back then were probably below Native Americans. That's pretty low. But he helped Curtis a lot with his work out at the Custer Battlefield. He reverted, unfortunately. He started drinking, got in a fight, and died in a jail in Billings. A very tragic. It was so hard for the Native Americans to go to these off-reservation schools because the folks back on the reservation tried to draw them back into their way of life, and they really ostracized them if they didn't. So there was an incredible push to revert, and one of the reversion outcomes is alcoholism. This is one of his famous Oasis on the Plains The Great Plains, Bob Capone's top 5 greatest images. The Scouts Report. And this is Plenty Coup, Chief of the Crow. Charlie Russell's friend, Frank Linderman, wrote American, which is considered one of the great books on any American chief. And he also wrote Red Mother, Linderman. So here's the title of my book on the chapter is Custer Almost Kills Curtis. Because like so many before him, Curtis gets obsessed with trying to figure out how could a white guy like Custer lose 300 soldiers to these Native Americans. I'm going to figure it out, and then all the elite scientists back east are going to say, you're a great man, and he'll have great standing. And so the 3 folks on the left are Crow Scouts. And Curtis was probably the 100th pigeon that had come through. Over the years, I've tracked endless artists and photographers who hooked up with these people, and they told them all sorts of stories that weren't true. But Curtis believed that Reno, one of his fellows that was supposed to lead the attack from the south, and I can't go into the Custer battle, but the scouts told him that Custer watched from a hill while the soldiers were being killed and mauled and everything, and watched there for 45 minutes, just watched them killed. And so Custer believed that. He was excited about it. He couldn't wait to get back to tell Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt said, hey, this ain't right. Edmund Meany in Washington said, you better stay away from it. Gifford Pinchot had just named a national forest after Custer, so he wasn't too hyped up on making Custer look bad. So Curtis, when he came out on his book on this, has a big Custer battlefield drawing that didn't mention any of this derogatory stuff towards Custer. One of the reasons why the Custer story was never really explored was because of Libby Custer. This is another Brady photograph. There's the son of the Morning Star, boy general, George Armstrong Custer on the left. This was during the Civil War. But Libby, until she died in 1933, suppressed any criticism of her husband. But after 1933, the next year, the books exploded about Custer. And he went from superstar to, in a lot of people's mind, devils. Native Americans' minds, he was a devil to begin with. They had it right. So after that debacle, he goes up into the plateau area. Now he dreams about Lewis and Clark, and here he is on the Columbia River with a boat going down the Columbia River, kind of visiting some of the sites where Lewis and Clark were. Remember that if you drive down I-84 on the Columbia River Gorge, that isn't anything what it looked like back then. This was before the dams. And when FDR started damming the Columbia in the 30s, it destroyed dozens of Indian sacred grounds and villages. They were all submerged, and a way of life that had been there for hundreds of years was gone. This is a couple of its photos on the Spokane. This is the fisherman at Wisham. The Great Northern stops here on the Washington side. And the Kootenai Rush Gatherer. This is Bob Capone's top 5. This is on Flathead Lake. And then this famous one, if any of you have any Custer books, or Curtis books, you probably have this image of the clock. You can kind of see in the middle there, that blurry image. He originally took it with the clock in it, and then they photoshopped it. Took that out. And that was very common with photographers. People that have these two in their books, I mean, this was just, everybody did this. Every photographer I know for the 30 years before him removed all sorts of things. L.A. Huffman had wine barrels in his Spotted Eagle's hostile village, and they X'd that out, or haystacks that was supposed to be out, in the early days. And so this was routine, and this is nothing to criticize Curtis about. So Curtis is blown through a couple $1 million by 1910-11. He's deep in debt, and he's thinking that this project's about over with. He can't go on. So he comes up with the idea of a kind of an opera that he would present at Carnegie Hall and around the country, where he presented his glass slides, the lantern slides that he had hand-colored. He had live music, big to-do. He had a kind of a Native American cannibal dance and headhunter dances, and the public loved it. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars on it, so went further in debt. So he thought, well, maybe guys in Hollywood, D.W. Griffith's made real successful, and Cecil B. DeMille, I'll go up to Vancouver Island and make a movie. So, in the land of the headhunters is formed. And for someone who's trying to get credibility with scientists, to come up with this melodramatic, romantic, 1 hour special was hard to figure. I don't know how he got the money. I think he conned people out of another couple million to make the movie. It was shown a couple times, and then he had no distribution. It was at the end of that. So this was his guide up at Vancouver Island, George Hunt. On the right, if you have Curtis books, this is how you probably saw him. On the left is how he looked decades earlier when Franz Boas, the great ethnologist, came to Vancouver Island. Boas, if you are an ethnologist fan, started the first ethnology department at Columbia and was a great supporter of Native Americans. His hero was Benjamin Franklin. But if you love Native Americans and want to know the early champion, it's Franz Boas, and his helper and interpreter was the same one that Curtis used. I would love to talk about all the scientific goofy things going on. They got into cranial size, saying the whites had the biggest brain, so they were the superior. It was the time of Darwin, started publishing his books in 1859, so there was scientific racism, Darwinism. They came up with the idea, the leading scientists and doctors, that black people originated in Africa. They were not related to the whites who originated in Europe, and Native Americans originated in North America, and none of them were genetically connected. And we now know that the modern Homo sapien came out of Africa around 200,000 years ago, and guess what? They were all black. The loss of pigment, black pigment, and I'm a dermatologist and I have a research lab on this, that is a really recent effect. So there haven't been a lot of white folk around for a long time. But in order to survive in northern climates, you had to get rid of the dark pigments so you could get vitamin D, else you die. So these are some of the images from making the movie. That's Curtis there, but he had someone else really, winding the camera. This is just for publicity. There's Curtis, again, on the camera, and George Hunt yelling out instructions to make the movie. And of course, Curtis wants to be seen as the dashing man. And the story about a whale, he's in a boat, the whale hits him and breaks his hip. And, well, they drug a dead whale up for the movie. And he probably had osteoarthritis like probably half the people in this audience do, and have had hip replacements. But another legend. This is the movie poster. Now, I can guarantee you that none of you have seen this image if you haven't seen my book, because after the debacle and World War I is going in Europe, it's not in the United States until, the United States doesn't get in until 1917. But Curtis kind of disappears, and he went to Yellowstone Park. This is actually a Curtis photograph of a grizzly bear in Yellowstone, and it's kind of symbolic of kind of Curtis up a tree. And he disappears. I think he worked so hard at times, he had relapses of his, what I think he had is tuberculosis. And, people can have tuberculosis and are carriers, they never get sick. Some people get sick and get well. Some people get it and they're dead in 3 months. It's a great germ to keep propagating. So 1916, about the time this bear picture was taken, Clara has had enough and she files for divorce. That percolates through the courts in Seattle till 1919. She accuses him of abandonment and also having other girlfriends. Enter Mara Ellis Ryan. Try find her in any of your Curtis books. Yet this is the closest relationship he had in 30 years. He met Mara out with the Hopi. She was taken into the Hopi tribe. She was the only white woman. The New York Times said she was the only white woman that was shown the secret rites. She loved the American Indians more than anybody as a woman. He loved the American Indians more than any other as a man. It was almost destined that the two would get together. Curtis goes to the Hopi reservation almost a dozen times for reasons that may be related to her, because that's where she was. They do the first, she was a romance, she was an actress, a romance writer, wildly popular. The most famous female romance writer in the country. And by the time Curtis gets divorced in 1919, ends up in LA with his daughter Beth, he has no money, he's living with his daughter, and she's having three of her books made into movies. And she connects him with Paramount, Cecil B. DeMille. And this is a gold tone of her. It's the only gold tone of a white woman. I asked Bob Capone if he'd ever seen one of a white woman. He's never seen one. There is a small one that he did of Beth, kind of a salesman sample. But he also, I'll show you in a minute, they did another book together right here called The Flute of the Gods. And there's one of Curtis's famous photographs on the cover, gold tones, really famous. And look how there's a special edition of it. Look how it's just like the North American Indian. So Curtis and her put that together. He provided like 24 of his photographs. And this image on the cover never made the North American Indian volumes. They were special for her. And this is, I actually got this from Chris Cardoza. Try find this deluxe book. This is another example of saying there are going to be 500 copies, just like the North American Indian. I bet there weren't 12 made. I've talked to dealers that have been dealing in these books for 50 years and they've never seen one. This is signed by Curtis and Amara. They started the Indian Welfare League together in 1923 out of the Southwest Museum, Charles Loomis's museum. And so she's an incredibly important person in his life. This is one of the images from her book, Prayer to the Stars in gold tone. I mean, any of you that buy Curtis stuff, you see this all the time. Again, this was not in the North American Indian. And then this is a smoke signal to the mountain gods, another one that was only in Ryan's book. Now, until recently, probably none of you have seen this Stickley cabinet from Stickley Brothers in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Not Gustav Stickley, he was in New York, and he did his own furniture and was editor of the Craftsman magazine. He was a big supporter of both Curtis and Mara Ellis Ryan. But one of Curtis's other projects is, well, I'll make a Stickley cabinet that holds a complete set of the North American Indian. Well, only one set was made. Guess who bought it? Mara Ellis Ryan. When she dies, she gives, in 1933, she gives that to Curtis, along with her set of the North American Indian. He did not have his own set. They were handed off to his daughter Beth, and then eventually the set was purchased by the Harvard of the West, the University of Oregon Ducks. And Phil Knight did not buy it. So Curtis's set is kind of strangely at the University of Oregon. So these are some of the stills he did that Mara set him up with Paramount Pictures. This is Tarzan. And look, he's got a flute, just like the Flute of the Gods. And this is Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. They filmed this at Santa Barbara. And still photographers would be on the set, and the actors would be in motion or something, and then they would stop, and the photographer would take their picture. And this is Castle of Dreams. He did these sensuous nudes, blue-toned silver gelatin prints. He did a number of these, something you wouldn't think Edward Curtis would do. So of real interest, and all of you Curtis lovers need to know that he didn't photograph the images and they didn't come out in order in the books. His Hopi book was not published until 1922. By 1922, he'd only published 11 volumes. He needed to do 9 more by 1930. And so all of these images were done 10, 20 years earlier. But it was almost an insurance policy. He gave the whole book to the Hopi. And as some of you know, that's with squash blossom hair. It showed that they were maidens and were available. And of course, 1977 Star Wars, Princess Leia. That's where Spielberg got that. Peaky Maker, one of his famous images, Gold Tones, was in that volume. But again, if you don't know that, you think, oh, 1922, he did all these, all these from Hopi. He didn't need to go to the Hopi reservation anymore because he was in LA with Mara. So that's kind of my thought. I'm probably in trouble for saying that. But he's needed to get the California tribes done. He really should have done it early on. He waited by the early 1920s. California doubled. The problem with California tribes is they were small, spread out. They'd lost most of their culture, and so he had a real hard time. This is actually Florence, his daughter, with him on the Klamath River. He went through California up into southern Oregon, and they were in a Chevrolet. So if any of you think again that he has a bunch of costumes to put on people, he just said, wear your Sunday best. And these are some of my favorite because they're Crater Lake. And, the Crater Lake Lodge would have been there by now. So Crater Lake Lodge is right behind us. I'm sure he stayed there. Needed to do a little cleanup around Taos, so we went down to Taos in that area. And these are the Taos water maidens. As you know, when you live in the Southwest, the premium thing is water. So the pottery was needed. It was utilitarian originally. I hope I have that right, Mark. So Curtis has 3 studios in LA. The first one was on Rampart Street. In the summer of 1923, he moves to the famed Biltmore Hotel that was just opening. That winter, Frank Kenny Johnson and others started the Biltmore Salon there in the lobby. Curtis has his studio right there next to him. This is the Art Deco sign from the studio. And so Curtis would have known Maynard Dixon, knew Charlie Russell, Will James. He photographed Will James too. And he photographed Charlie Russell, visited him. Charlie had been up in San Francisco visiting Dorothea Lange and Maynard Dixon at 728 Montgomery Street, which was open until 1939. And so the whole giants, the triad of what I believe are the giants of Western American art, Russell, Dixon, and Curtis, within a few weeks had that connection. This is the only signed, this is a gelatin silver print, border print, signed by both Russell and Curtis, taken in 1924. Curtis had a show at the Biltmore Salon. I think Dixon follow up? And they went to the Biltmore Salon because they were charging less than some of the other galleries, Stedville, or how do you say it, gallery. Anybody know who this is? Helen Keller. Remember The Miracle Worker? 1962, Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke. Winner of Best Actress and Supporting Actress of the Year. Helen Keller shows up in 1925 with Anne Sullivan and has Curtis take a picture. This is one of her alone, and then they have one of her with Anne Sullivan. She was there to support it. For those of you that don't know who Helen Keller was, she was basically blind and deaf. And Anne Sullivan was called a miracle worker because as a child she developed her into the most famous woman in America. There were Broadway plays about her even back then, before the miracle worker. So his last volume, he goes up into Alberta, does some volumes of the Blackfoot Indians up there, goes to Oklahoma, really disappointing in Oklahoma. The Osage got the oil, and then you saw Killer of the Flower Moon, and they found them to be very haughty and didn't want anything to do with customs and culture. And you have the Osage that were really wealthy, and then everybody else in the state was really poor. And as you know, there are a number of tribes that migrated to Oklahoma, Indian territory, that was supposed to be theirs forever until the land rushes. So they went north to Alaska. This is a Sidney Lawrence, the great painter of Alaska, on their last trip, and he went with his daughter Beth on this one, just the two of them. And it wasn't like the Harriman in luxury. This is just on a steamer. They went around and photographed the Native Americans. By then, 60% of the population of the Inuit, not Eskimo, that is a derogatory, they want to be called the Inuit, had been killed by tuberculosis, our old friend. Today, Alaska has more tuberculosis than any other state. So this is an iconic image of the family. Curtis Legacy doing a descendant project where they're finding the descendants of them, and they photographed the little daughter. The sad thing here is after this photograph, she's taken away by the nuns to a school and beaten and starved. Didn't see her parents for years. But there's Curtis and Beth kayaking around. Just again, a shout out to J.P. Morgan's son, Jack Morgan. By then, in the early 30s, we're in the Depression. Artists, no one's making any money, they're all starving. And he'd gotten control of the North American Indian and all the photogravures, and he was going through his own problems because people wanted to blame the recession or the Depression on the Morgans. The Glass-Steagall Act, you remember that one? Which separated banking from savings, which was then repealed, I think, in 1989. But at that point, they separated the Morgan holdings, and now they started Morgan Chase at that point. And it's on your credit cards, I guess. But anyway, he's gone through hell in the 30s in front of the Senate, investigated, and they sell all of the North American Indians material to a bookstore in Boston, the Laureate bookstore. Copper plates put in storage and rediscovered in the 70s. I talk about it at the end of the book. And it was good they were stored because in World War II, if they hadn't been stored, they would have all been melted. Because copper, in 1943, they had the steel pennies for your coin collectors. Anybody know who this is? Yeah, it's not the good ship Lollipop, but it's Shirley, 1945, Edward Curtis photographs her. Quite a change from Princess Angeline, 50 years earlier or whatever. So this is the late 40s. There's Florence and Curtis, Catherine, Billy, Harold, Beth. There's a gold tone of Canyon de Chelly in the background, a large one that was auctioned off a couple of years ago. They all loved him. He was an absentee father, and to show his charisma, they didn't like their mother, but they loved the guy. I mean, figure that one out. I mean, he was a charismatic person, and this is the last one. He dies in 1952. This is the last one by his son-in-law, Magnuson, that ran the studios in Los Angeles. Mag was a well-known professional photographer. So, what do these folks have in common? Russell, Dixon, and Curtis. I think like anybody that is a leader or inspires, I think it's the idea of hope. And all great leaders and really a lot of great paintings express hope. Now this is a fascinating one. I could spend hours on this. I give a whole talk to the Russell Museum staff on pagans, one of Russell's most famous. But this has been misrepresented in book after book of the nostalgic, the end of the Indians, it's at night, they're all going into the sunset, when in fact it is exactly the opposite. I know exactly where this is. This is a sunrise. This is an optimistic painting. On the far right is his son, Jack. I have a photograph of Jack in my Charles and Russell Photographing the Legend book of that exact, where that hair is going straight down over the eye. I have the exact image of that. That's Russell up front, and it's hard to see in this image, but what was Russell's most famous childhood book? The Headless Horseman. And if you look closely behind that front chief with the pole, the guy behind him doesn't have a head. He's headless. So next time you look at pagans, look at that. I have known no one that has picked that one up before. And of course, the great Maynard Dixon, Blackfeet Pony Boy, all full of inspiration. Rumor has it that Mark Sublet was the model for that. Is that true, Mark? I'm trying to give you a compliment, Mark, here. But anyway, and even thinking about the vanishing ray is kind of depressing, but you know, you look at this, and the images on the screen here are pretty dark, but they're actually moving into the light, if you look at that. They're not going into darkness, they're going into light. And I spent a lot of time with Ansel Adams' assistant talking about the lighting effects, and he was just in awe with the cameras that Curtis had at that point that he could pull this image off. But I think Curtis might be sending us all a joke just like Charlie Russell did in Pagans. Because people don't realize this was in the first book, or volume, but so was Out of the Darkness. And it was in the first volume also. You know, and he had lots of baby scenes, hope, wedding scenes, mother and child. And so I'm concluding now, we're within a minute of the end, and I wondered how I should end this. And so I thought I'd end it the way that I ended in the book, and I normally don't do this, but I thought I'd read this to you. That a scientific invention like photography in a race he didn't know could inspire a young man from humble beginnings in the heartland to spend his life capturing a time in indigenous history before ethnic cleansing cannot be explained. It is a mystery to be embraced. Even though we may not understand, it's the reaching out that's most important. He couldn't see it all, and neither can we. For those who love Curtis's world, keep the faith. He had a kind of homesickness for a time in the West when it was only lit by fire, which he never visited, but never stopped longing for. Shadows of faces and landscapes marked his way in a voyage fueled by a big dream. You only die a second time when no one speaks your name anymore. The shadow catcher and the indigenous race are alive and well, speaking their name continues. This is on the book. For me, Edward Curtis has not become a name, but an emotion. What he accomplished, I think, is supernatural. I did a book called The American West Reimagined. 12 pounds, 120 of the great Western American artists. Curtis is in there. I think all of them pale in compared to what he accomplished. I think it's supernatural. It's a mystery that you can't explain, and kind of echoing Norman MacLean from A River Runs Through It, I'm haunted by legends and shadows. Thank you.